let's speak to an analyst now, somebody who can help us put some of this into perspective. Dr. Alan Mendoza. Doctor, thank you so much for your time. Now, you heard, I don't know how much you heard of Fatima there.
I heard enough.
She seemed to, and I know lots of people are, at taking Iraq in 2003 and looking at all subsequent events in terms of the increase of the terrorist threat, the rising in the Arab Spring, and it all goes back in their mind to 2003. Is that an oversimplification?
I'm afraid so. If you looked at the timeline of events, Islamic radicalization predates Iraq. Al-Qaeda predates Iraq. If you look at things like the Arab Spring, they have less to do with things like Iraq, but more to do with an upsurge of freedom and demands against corrupt and venal dictatorships, such as Saddam Hussein's would have been had it still been around in 2011, than they do with any military intervention in Iraq or anything of that kind. And indeed, the contemporary situation in Iraq has more to do with the mismanagement of the Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, after the Americans left with their security guarantor, than it has to do anything with the Iraq war itself.
Well, hold on.
We've seen the Chilcot.
Yes.
Lots of mistakes have been made. We see that. It's quite clear. But what Chilcot doesn't state is what happened afterwards in Iraq, post-surge, and what happens after the Americans leave. It's two very different things.
Well, it may be two different things, but if you are going to take over a sovereign state, I would suggest if people's lives are at stake, then you may as well flaming out have an idea of what's going to happen when you're in and when you leave. And if you do that, then it's not difficult for me to argue that you're derelict in your duty.
Well, absolutely agree with that point. Chilcot quite rightly points out the many flaws in post-invasion planning. I think everyone's pointed those out. There's not one person who can possibly defend what happened in Iraq after the invasion was successful. But I think, again, there are two or three different points here. There are people who are angry about the war itself. Then there are people who, and I think they're wrong, I think there are people who are angry about what happened after the war, and I think everyone is right about that. And then there are people who think the war is responsible for every ill in the Middle East, and they're wrong as well.
In terms of Tony Blair, history doesn't look at the minute as though it's going to be very kind to him, does it?
No, I don't think right now at this moment in time. That said, I think he gave a strong performance in terms of defending his record just now. And it's worth bearing in mind that for all the criticisms that your previous guest said, for example, he's a war criminal, all the rest of it, none of those have been proved. The Chilcot report makes it quite clear, in fact, he isn't a war criminal. So I suspect that Tony Blair's legacy will indeed be Iraq. Whether that will be seen in the light that we see it today, who knows? That's for historians to write in 10, 20, 30 years' time.
Stay with me, Doctor. Let me just remind everybody what we're talking about. It's the long-awaited Chilcot inquiry, 7 years in the making. It's talking about our occupation, liberation, invasion, call it what you will, of Iraq back in 2003. Many people have already come to a conclusion, and this, I suppose, would confirm what many people already thought. But what I'd like to know is how you feel, how you felt in 2003. Those images of the statue being pulled down, people beating that statue with the slippers, the American flag going up and then being pulled down. How did you feel when you watched it? How did you feel subsequently? And how do you think history will remember Tony Blair? Here's a man who was on his feet for 90 minutes defending himself, saying, I did it for the best interest. Have you asked yourself what would have happened if Saddam Hussein had remained in place? Is that area a safer place post the invasion of Iraq? Maybe the London bombings in 2005, to your mind, certainly to Fatima's, all the subsequent events are directly linked to 2003. And what do you think should happen now in terms of those in office? And I'm looking over my shoulder, Foreign Secretary Jack Straw putting up a defence. Tony Blair already has. I've heard Alistair Campbell do it today. I'll be speaking to Baroness Tessa Giles a little while. I'd love to hear from you. The war in Iraq and what's happened subsequently. If you're serving personnel, how are you feeling right now? 179 serving personnel and over 150,000 Iraqis dying as a consequence of that war. 020-722-4200 is our number. Text 81333 and start your message with the word London. Please forgive me, Doctor. People are tuning in all the time and I need to keep them abreast of what is happening. Now, you're the exec director of the Henry Jackson Society. It's a pro-democracy think tank. In terms of the governance at that time, it seemed to me, from what I've read, to be some sort of sofa governing, where people like let's say Mr. Cook did not feel entirely welcome as the speaker to come forward and to challenge and to put his point of view. And if you look at I am with you, whatever, it would, I don't think, be a huge leap to say, I've made my decision to back you no matter what. Now I have to be creative in finding justification for it.
Yeah, but again, that's not what Chilcot's concluded. He's concluded that Blair did this in good faith. He believed absolutely in the WMD threat. He believed the intelligence he had. Yes, he exaggerated it. I think we all know that as well in terms of what happened. But he exaggerated to win a political argument. And let's not forget, people like Cook and others, many others in the cabinet at the time, had every right to harry and demand and to say to the Prime Minister of the day, actually, we want more from you. But they didn't.
But is that what we want from a Prime Minister, Doctor? To exaggerate to back a point that you want to make, as opposed to looking at the evidence and making your decision based upon what you are confronted with?
The underlying evidence supports what Blair said. The underlying evidence supported that. He exaggerated, there's no question. The certainty he said it was wrong. But I ask you, and I ask all your listeners, is that any different to what any Prime Minister does for any single issue they have to win in a political discussion in this country? Any single one, whether it's NHF, whether transport, whether it is defence, anything. That's what politicians do.
When you are sending people out to die, 150,000 Iraqis, 179 British service personnel. When it is already on record that we have not sent our troops out with right, proper and adequate equipment, I put it to you that you better be sure.
On the planning side, absolutely agree with you on that score. When it comes to other issues, we all know that Saddam Hussein was a threat. Everyone knew that implicitly. Since 1991, he had refused to comply with UN weapons inspectors and everything else. His own generals thought he had a weapons program. I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to say that if we hadn't gone to war at that precise moment in 2003, we would have done the next year or the year after that. It was inevitable because Saddam Hussein would never have complied.
It's absolutely fantastic to speak to you, Doctor, and I hope that you and I get a chance to debate again. Dr. Alan Mendoza, Exec Director of the Henry Jackson Society there.